recording? Okay, I am recording. All right, sick. So, this is an appendix to Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. It's titled Marx on Backwardness and on Russia. On the face of it, nothing seems more incongruous than the supposed relevance of Marx's writings to the Russia of the late 19th century. It has become a commonplace by now to note that corpus of thought and social investigation which constituted the work of Marx was directly linked to a particular period in Western history, and is therefore best understood and most relevant within that context. Marx wrote primarily about the West and, more specifically, about the part of the West which Marx called, quote, capitalist. By this, Marx meant a form of society which had abandoned an agricultural economy for an industrial economy, in which labor was wage labor and the means of production in private hands, and in which two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, were predominant. Marx saw socialism in general, and his own version of socialism in particular, as a child conceived in the very womb of this form of society, as a historically rooted reaction to this form of society, and as an emerging model of the post-capitalist future. Quite clearly, therefore, a society such as Russia was in Marx's own lifetime, or even thereafter, a society such as Russia was in Marx's own lifetime, or even thereafter, hardly provided a welcome context for Marx's ideas, nor an arena within which they could be tested. Nevertheless, Marx's thought also constituted a theory which presumed to provide at least the methodological means for analyzing all societies. Marx's own interests were centered on European capitalist society, but inevitably, Marx's own interests led Marx to examine non-capitalist societies as well. It is necessary to distinguish between two subjects which, in this context, occupied Marx's attention at various stages of Marx's work. The one, which will not concern us here, is what may be called pre-capitalist society, and has to do with the purely historical question of the economic development of Western Europe. This was the, quote, laboratory, end quote, of Marx's materialist view of history, for it provided the framework within which Marx could trace the stages of economic change, particularly as it took place in feudal society. The other is the more remote, but in our context, the more directly relevant subject of non-capitalist, non-Western society, or one characterized by the, quote, Asiatic mode of production, end quote, as Marx himself defined it, a subject which intermittently fascinated Marx, but to which Marx devoted no systematic attention. Footnote: Marx's writings on this subject consist primarily of the articles Marx dispatched from the 1850s onward to the New York Daily Tribune as the New York Daily Tribune's London correspondent. These, together with private correspondence and relevant excerpts from Marx's general theoretical works, are collected in Shlomo Avineri's edited volume, Marx on Colonialism and Modernization, published in 1968. I'm going to look this book up. I'm not seeing really anything on yeah, I'm not seeing anything on this book. Okay. Such of Marx and Engels' writings as deal specifically with Russia have been collected in Paul Blackstock and Bert Hoselitz's edited volume, Marx and Engels, The Russian Menace to Europe, published in 1953. Probably going to be nothing on this either. End footnote. The importance of this subject grew out of Marx's recognition that the Western historical experience was hardly universal and that the existence of static or unchanging and virtually stagnant, quote, Asiatic economies posed serious problems for Marx's own dynamic, quote, dialectical view of history. Footnote. This aspect of Marx's work has only recently and infrequently received attention. See in particular the introduction by Avenatti. See Karl A. Wittvogel's Oriental Despotism. And the essay Oriental Despotism in George Lichtheim's The Concept of Ideology. Sorry, looking these books up. And see also an earlier account of Marx's views, Solomon F. Bloom, The World of Nations, published in 1941. Anyway, end footnote. Maybe the internet will decide to work in this fucking house. Eventually. But it doesn't look good. A brief summary of Marx's views concerning the, quote, Asiatic mode of production is here essential in order to grasp Marx's later ambivalent attitudes towards Russian society. In the famous Preface to a Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859, Marx almost offhandedly treated the Asiatic mode as if the Asiatic mode were a part of universal economic development and related the Asiatic mode to the various historical stages experienced in Europe. Thus Marx declared, quote, in broad outlines, Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois modes of production can be designated as progressive epochs in the economic formation of society. End quote. Marx. Dude, come on. I hate this computer. And footnote, the inclusion of the, quote, Asiatic, end quote, raises numerous questions. In what sense could the Asiatic mode be seen as having given rise to later modes? What was the dialectical relationship, a relationship which constituted the basis of Marx's view of historical change, between the first and the others? Moreover, in what sense could the Asiatic be described as a, quote, progressive epoch? One second. Come on, you piece of shit. Oh my fucking god. Sorry, I had to restart my computer because it sucks. So I don't know where I was, but I think I'll start where I think I was. The inclusion of the quote Asiatic raises numerous questions. In what sense could the Asiatic mode be seen as having given rise to the latter modes? What was the dialectical relationship, a relationship which constituted the basis of Marx's view of historical change, between the first and the others? Moreover, in what sense could the Asiatic be described as a quote progressive epoch? End quote. Before the above cited preface, however, Marx had intermittently turned his attention to the problem of backward Asiatic societies, particularly in his articles during the 1850s for the New York Daily Tribune. It is evident that the problem was a source of some disquiet to Marx, primarily because Marx's unifying mind was confronted by a dichotomous world. On the one hand, a developing dynamic Europe, on the other, a stagnant, static Asia. It was obvious to Marx, in fact, that there was not the remotest relationship between the two, that consequently human history was not as universal as his general theoretical writings had assumed, and that it was necessary to make allowance for a serious exception, one, moreover, which encompassed an extremely large territorial and demographic area containing nations such as China and India. The differences between the Asiatic mode and the others were noted by Marx himself. Firstly, while the latter were all characterized in one form or another by the fundamental institution of private property, the former was based primarily on common ownership of land. Secondly, the Asiatic world, or at least a substantial part of the Asiatic world, had a unique form of social organization, the village community. The peculiar features of this community were common ownership of land, the union of agriculture and manufacturing, almost complete social and economic autonomy, and minimal contact with the outside world. For Marx's description of the village system, see in particular Marx's article of the 25th of June, 1853, The British Rule in India, in Marx Engels Selected Works 1. End footnote. The village system was in turn mainly responsible for the third unique feature of the Asiatic world, a feature having no counterpart in the West, namely what Marx called, quote, Oriental despotism. This is a highly concentrated, bureaucratic, and conservative form of government made possible by the autarkic nature of the society and the non-involvement of the various village communities in the provision of the common needs of society as a whole. Finally, and above all, what distinguished the Asiatic mode of production from the ancient, the feudal, and the bourgeois was that the Asiatic mode of production was completely unchanging. In fact, for Marx, as for Hegel before Marx, the Orient was, quote, unhistorical, or simply lacking in history, since the Orient's experience was a uniform, monotonous repetition of the same thing. Contrary to all that Marx had noted about the European world, the Asiatic contained no forces within itself working for change and progress. This clearly negated Marx's very philosophy of history, as Marx himself must have recognized in spite of the facile juxtaposition in the preface of 1859. Nevertheless, Marx made no attempt either to account for it theoretically or to adjust his European-centered theoretical premises. But, in any case, in the 19th century, the problem of the eternal nature of Asiatic society was becoming an almost purely academic one. For by this time, Asian society was changing, though not through its own internal mechanisms. And what really concerned Marx in his writings on the Orient was the practical, social, and political question of the impact of the West, through its economic, quote, imperialist, end quote, penetration on the societies of China, India, and the Middle East. Like others, Marx clearly perceived the traumatic element in this impact, the disintegration of traditional hierarchies, the dislocation of populations, the transformation of work habits, and the crumbling of ancient cultures. All this, to be sure, was still in its early stages, but it was, in Marx's view, an irreversible process, though made more difficult to bear for those affected by the fact that it arose not out of the, quote, dialectical needs of the societies themselves, but out of conquest or penetration by foreign alien powers. For Marx, however, the negative destructive impact was outweighed by other considerations. In the first place, since the Asiatic mode of production was stagnant and unchanging, conquest by European imperialism was the only way of bringing Asia into the mainstream of progressive, universal life. Secondly, the transformation of Asia was a precondition both for the undermining of capitalism and the eventual triumph of socialism. This second point arose naturally from Marx's understanding that capitalism could not collapse so long as capitalism had backward colonies to lean on. Footnote. This thesis was, of course, the basis later for various Marxist theories of imperialism. End footnote. And from the universal view of socialism which Marx had consistently advocated, a view which predicated the socialist millennium upon a general revolutionary conflagration in Europe and elsewhere, and the creation of one universal human community. What was happening in Asia was therefore cruel but unavoidable and necessary, just as capitalism had been in its own time in Europe. Whatever the paradox, Marx can therefore be seen as a, quote, supporter of European imperialism, though obviously so that it may the better be destroyed eventually. This clearly emerges in many of his statements, of which the following is a striking but representative example. Quote, England, it is true, in causing a social revolution in Hindustan, was actuated only by the vilest interest, and was stupid in manner of enforcing them. But that is not the question. The question is, can mankind fulfill its destiny without a fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia? If not, whatever may have been the crimes of England, England was the unconscious tool of history in bringing about that revolution. End quote. Marx. That's from The British Rule in India. The article concludes with the following stanza from Goethe's Westlicher Divan on Suleika. And the lines are, should this torture then torment us, since it brings us greater pleasure? Were not, through the rule of Timur, souls devoured without measure? And that's the end of the Goethe article, Goethe stanza. But see also the article, The Future Results of British Rule in India, in Marx's Selected Works 1. Both this and the previously quoted article were written by Marx in English. Okay, I tried to look up some books before. I'm going to try to look up this one. Wikipedia says West-Östlicher Divan, or West Eastern Divan, is a diwan, or collection of lyrical poems by the German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. It was inspired by Goethe's readings of the Persian national poet Hafez. Okay, sorry, I'm just looking to see if any of these things, these other books that I tried to look up earlier are available. Wittfogel's Oriental Despotism is available. The description of it is available. Oriental Despotism, a comparative study of total power, is a book of political theory and comparative history by Karl August Wittfogel, who lived from 1896 to 1988, published by Yale University Press in 1957. Oriental Despotism offers an explanation for the despotic governments in, quote, Oriental societies, where control of water was necessary for irrigation and flood control. Managing these projects required large-scale bureaucracies, which dominated the economy, society, and religious life. This despotism differed from the Western experience, where power was distributed among contending groups. The book argues that this form of, quote, hydraulic despotism characterized ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, Hellenistic Greece and Imperial Rome, the Abbasid Caliphate, Imperial China, the Mughal Empire, and Incan Peru. Wittfogel further argues that 20th century Marxist-Leninist regimes such as the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, though they were not themselves hydraulic societies, did not break away from their historical condition and remained systems of, quote, total power and, quote, total terror. The book was both welcomed as a historically grounded analysis of despotism that warned the West against the expansion of communist totalitarianism and criticized as a Cold War polemic. The materialist and ecological theories in Oriental despotism influenced ecological anthropologists and global economic historians, even though some of them found fault with its methodology and empirical basis or questioned Wittfogel's political motives.
You returned.
Hello. The concept of ideology and other essays by George Lichtheim is described as, the description says, a distinguished philosopher and social critic examines the development of modern political ideologies, their major exponents, and their role in the contemporary world. George Lichtheim poses this question in the remarkable essay from which the title of this volume is drawn. In that article, he sets out to define the nature and status of political ideology from the Puritan upheaval of the 17th century through the French Revolution and the rise of the great intellectual systems of the 19th century to the totalitarian movements of our own age. Expanding on this theme, Lichtheim focuses the first section of this collection on the greatest and most successful of the ideological systems, that of Marx, as well as on the related questions of class and Oriental despotism. Lichtheim then proceeds to discuss the historical underpinnings, Rousseau, de Maistre, Hobbes, Hegel, and the development of political thought between the French and Russian revolutions. Lichtheim follows this with a series of pieces that take the reader through the arid period that Lichtheim calls, quote, the European Civil War between communism and fascism, end quote, to the post-Stalin era where he finds philosophers of ideology emerging once again. Okay. And that Frank Solomon Bloom, The World of Nations, a study of the national implications in the work of Karl Marx. The description says is published by Columbia University Press, 1941, and studies the national implications of the work of Marx in the world while looking at capitalism, revolution, and unification. Okay, so back to the text and footnote. There we are. The capitalism and capitalism's imperialist guise as a progressive force in the world thus follows unequivocally from Marx's analysis. But must capitalism itself be erected in Asia? Must the backward but now evolving societies of this continent go through the same economic development as once the destiny of Europe, as was once the destiny of Europe? We know, of course, that in the case of Europe, Marx saw the various stages of economic transformation as necessary, inevitable, and historically logical. Before there could be capitalism, there had to be feudalism, and socialism, in turn, was inconceivable without capitalism. Was this also the case as far as the non-European world was concerned? Apparently, yes. For all that Marx wrote on the subject, without however answering the question directly, suggested that the Asiatic mode of production was destined to be replaced by bourgeois economic forms, though without going through the intermediary, quote, ancient and, quote, feudal stages, since capitalism could only, quote, export itself, not its historical past. Thus, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote, quote, the bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of the bourgeoisie's commodities are the heavy artillery with which the bourgeoisie batters down all Chinese walls, with which the bourgeoisie forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. The bourgeoisie compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. The bourgeoisie compels them to introduce what the bourgeoisie calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, the bourgeoisie creates a world after the bourgeoisie's own image. End quote. Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. This seems as unambiguous as it can be, but when we come to look at Marx's observations on Russia, a much more complicated picture emerges of the problem in general and of Russia in particular, which suggests that Marx had not quite made up his mind and preferred perhaps to leave the question open. That Marx took a special interest in Russia is obvious from a remark in a letter written in 1877, quote, in order that I might be specially qualified to estimate the economic development in Russia, I learnt Russian and then for many years studied the official publications and others bearing on this subject, end quote. Marx. Some of Marx's earliest followers were Russians, and is well known, the first translation in 1872 of Das Kapital was into the Russian language, but the real reason for Marx's interest was undoubtedly the very peculiar, perhaps unique, nature of Russian society and the revolutionary implications of this. The problem was how to locate and define Russia on the social map. Was Russia a European nation, Asiatic, or a combination of the two? That Russia did not belong to the mainstream of European development was clearly evident to all, but neither could Russia be classified as a typical Asiatic society. Marx does not seem to have used the term, quote, semi-Asiatic as a practical solution, though it does appear in an article of 1853 signed by him but apparently written by Engels. Where am I? Footnote. Russia is here said to be semi-Asiatic in her, quote, condition, manners, traditions, and institutions, ... end quote, Marx. During the 1850s, when Marx made observations about Russia in the context of commentaries on the, quote, Eastern Question and the conflict with Turkey, Marx treated Russia as a patently backward, non-European, and reactionary power. Footnote. See in particular the New York Daily Tribune articles of the 12th of April and 14th of July 1853, reprinted in Avenary. End footnote. It was Russia's role in international affairs which interested Marx at this time, but Marx's views were governed by the assumption that Russian government and society were hopelessly archaic. Marx therefore portrayed Russia as a, quote, menace, as a dangerous upstart dabbling in European matters. In the Crimean War, Marx's sympathies were wholly on the side of the Turks, which meant, of course, the British and the French. This is perfectly consistent with Marx's view of capitalism and capitalism's imperialist dress as a progressive revolutionizing force. Marx wanted the Ottoman Empire to be overrun by, quote, universal capitalism and not by the reactionary particularistic Tsarist autocracy. A victory for Russia would thus constitute a setback for the universalizing potentialities of European capitalism. Quote, ... let Russia get possession of Turkey, and Russia's strength is increased by nearly half, and Russia becomes superior to all the rest of Europe put together. Such an event would be an unspeakable calamity to the revolutionary cause. The maintenance of Turkish independence, or in case of a possible dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the arrest of the Russian scheme of annexation, is a matter of the highest moment. In this instance, the interests of the revolutionary democracy and of England go hand in hand. End quote. Footnote from an article titled Real Issue in Turkey from the New York Daily Tribune, 12th of April, 1853. Also in Avenari's collected volume. Between the middle of the 1850s and the 1870s, there is a gap in Marx's writings on Russia. However, when in the middle of the latter decade, Marx returned to the subject, Marx's former attitude towards Russian society as fundamentally reactionary appeared to have undergone a considerable modification. It has been suggested that by this time Marx had come to discover certain positive factors in Asiatic society, particularly in the traditional village community. However, the more probable reason for his renewed and more hopeful interest in Russia was the growing influence of Marx's ideas among Russian intellectuals, albeit particularly those connected with the populist movement. Footnote. For the intricate questions involved in the relations between Marxism, and populism, see Andrei Velitzky, The Controversy Over Capitalism, published in 1969. Shit. Okay, so for Andrei Velitzky's The Controversy Over Capitalism, the description from University of Notre Dame Press says, this book presents an analysis of classical Russian populism, shown as an ideological structure within which many positions were possible. Velitzky studies the confrontation of populism and Marxism, changing attitudes toward Marxism in the populist milieu, and the controversy between populists and Marxists over the future of Russia. The Controversy Over Capitalism book, available here in paper for the first time, reinterprets the ideology of Russian populism. Andrei Velitzky argues that populism is a reaction to the development of capitalism in Russia and a response to the capitalist economy and socialist ideologies in the West. End footnote. Or back to the text, end footnote. Where am I? Moreover, since the emancipation of 1861, the Russian village commune had become a central issue in Russian revolutionary debates, and for the populace the basis for a Russian form of socialism, Marx could hardly avoid contemplating the new developments in Russia, especially since Marx's Russian, quote, students now turned directly to Marx for an evaluation of socialist prospects in Russia. Marx says that Marx began in 1870 to study Russian and to refamiliarize himself with Russian internal developments, but it was not until 1877 that Marx apparently felt confident enough to make a more than passing statement concerning Russian social questions. The occasion which gave rise to it was an article by the Russian populist N.K. Mikhailovsky, which had appeared in October 1877 in the issue of the Russian journal Otechestvenia Sapisky, Fatherland Notes. Footnote. For the circumstances surrounding the writing of this article and quotations from it, see Richard Kindersley, the first Russian revisionist. See also the bibliographical note in Blackstock and Hoselitz. End footnote. In interpreting Marx's, quote, historico-philosophical views, end quote, Mikhailovsky reached the conclusion that according to Marx, a Russian socialist must first work for the destruction of the village commune, Obshchina, in order to create the basis for the development of capitalism without which socialism was impossible. This was, of course, a strictly mechanistic reading of Marx, which assumed Marx to have discovered and postulated a universal, inevitable law of economic development through which all societies were fated to travel. But it was certainly not an unreasonable interpretation if one bears in mind Marx's concept of capitalism as a universalizing phenomenon. Nevertheless, Marx reacted immediately and in the strongest possible terms. In November, Marx drafted a letter to the editorial board of the Otechestvenia Zapisky. Although Marx failed to send it off, it was later passed on by Engels to Vera Zasulich in Geneva, where it appeared in the May 1884 issue of Vestnik Narodnoi Voli, and, still later, in 1888, it was published in Russian itself in the Moscow magazine Yurid-Ichesky Vestnik. The letter thus had a wide circulation and must have come to the attention of many Russian revolutionaries, both populist and Marxist. After dismissing Mikhailovsky's claim that he had once derided the Russian village commune, Marx comes straight to the point. Quote, I have arrived at this conclusion. If Russia continues to pursue the path Russia has followed since 1861, Russia will lose the finest chance ever offered by history to a people and undergo all the fatal vicissitudes of the capitalist regime, end quote. This, in Marx's view, means that if Russia chooses to follow the capitalist path, quote, Russia will experience capitalism's pitiless laws like other profane peoples, end quote. There's a couple of footnotes here. And actually, it looks like it's just one footnote that actually has text. It's not just a citation. In the appendix to the first German edition of Das Kapital, Marx had attacked Herzen for believing that the Russian village commune could serve as a basis for the regeneration of Europe. In his 1877 letter, Marx says that his dismissal of this belief implied nothing about the significance of the commune in Russian society. End footnote. Marx points out that in Capital, Marx had been concerned to trace only the path through which, in, quote, Western Europe, capitalism had emerged. He He had not claimed that everywhere capitalism must emerge. In spite of this, Mikhailovsky had attributed to Marx a grandiose universal theory. Quote, one second. I want to see if this quote's from. Quote, he feels he absolutely must metamorphose my historical sketch of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a historico-philosophic theory of the general path every people is fated to tread, whatever the historical circumstances in which it finds itself, in order that it may ultimately arrive at the form of economy which ensures, together with the greatest expression of the productive powers of social labor, the most complete development of man. End quote, Marx. After citing the experience of the plebeians of ancient Rome as an example of how, quote, different historical surroundings, end quote, can lead to totally different consequences, in the case of the plebeians, whose initial conditions were somewhat analogous to those of the modern proletariat, the result was not wage labor or capitalism, but a mode of production based on slavery. Marx concludes, quote, by studying each of these forms of evolution separately, and then comparing these forms of evolution, one can easily find the clue to this phenomenon, bracket, i.e. of different results, end bracket. But one will never arrive there by using as one's master key a general historico-philosophical theory, the supreme virtue of which consists in being super-historical, end quote. Marx. This obviously constituted a major and unequivocal statement of Marx's theoretical position, and must have been a source of encouragement to those Russians who envisaged a different path for Russian socialism. But did that path lead through the village commune as populists believed? About this we get no clear commitment from Marx. Following the already mentioned denial of having once derided the commune, Marx makes only one further reference to this subject. In the second paragraph of the letter, Marx notes that the, quote, great Russian scholar and critic, end quote, N.G. Chernyshevsky, had concluded that Russia need not destroy the village commune and pass to capitalism, but can avoid the, quote, tortures of capitalism by, quote, developing the historical conditions, specifically her own, end quote. On this, Marx comments, quote, my honorable critic, bracket, i.e. Mikhailovsky, end bracket, would have had at least as much reason for inferring from my consideration for this, quote, great Russian scholar and critic, end quote, that I shared his views on the question, as for concluding from my polemic against the, quote, literary man and pan-Slavist, i.e. Alexander Herzen, end bracket, that I rejected them, end quote. Marx. This is certainly a convoluted way of taking a stand. Besides, it is not followed, as it should be, by any analysis of the commune or by argumentation in the commune's favor. On the contrary, in another sentence, Marx claims to have polemicized against Herzen because Herzen had, quote, discovered the Russian commune not in Russia, but in a book, ... end quote. Footnote. The references to the book Russian Studies by Baron von Haxthausen, a Prussian counselor of state, who in 1847, after traveling to Russia, had published this work in which he extolled the village commune. I'm not seeing any descriptions of this book online. End footnote. Marx may therefore be taken to have implied that the commune is more a relic of the past than a living reality. Marx returned to the question of the village commune on two other occasions, the one in 1881 in a letter to Vera Zasulich, the other in the well-known preface of 1882 to the second Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto. The letter to Zasulich was a reply to a direct appeal for guidance. Quote, You understand, comrade, end quote, Zasulich had written to Marx, quote, how profoundly your opinion on this question interests us, and what a great service you would render us if you expounded your ideas on the possible destiny of our village community and on the theory of the historical necessity for all countries of the world to pass through all phases of capitalist production, end quote. Zasulich. Footnote. This full English translation from which this quotation is taken is of Zasulich's letter to Marx, appears in Blackstock and Hoselitz, edited volume. End footnote. In concluding, Zasulich requested permission to publish Marx's reply in Russia. Marx apparently now decided to go into the matter seriously and systematically, for in preparing a reply, Marx drew up 4 fairly lengthy drafts. These dealt in an extensive way both with the general nature of village communities and the specific Russian example. Footnote. The drafts were discovered only in 1911 and not published until 1926 by David Ryazanov in the Marx-Engels Archiv. See the bibliographical note in Blackstock and Hoselitz. This is edited volume. The latter also contains a composite version in English of the 4 drafts. Only the letter which Marx actually sent off is discussed here, since the drafts, remaining unknown, could play no role in influencing Russian revolutionaries. End footnote. In the event, however, Marx chose to dispatch only a short letter, most of which was concerned with the interpretation of certain passages in Capital, and which contained only a brief paragraph on the village commune as such. Footnote. The English version of the letter is in Selected Correspondence, pages 411 to 412. It was published for the first time only in 1924, but its contents were known to most of the original Russian Marxists, i.e. the, quote, emancipation of labor group. End footnote. Where am I? The passages from Capital are cited by Marx to show, as in the letter of 1877, that his analysis of capitalist development was meant to be valid for Western Europe alone, with the obvious implication that development need not be repeated elsewhere. Footnote. Quote, hence the, quote, historical inevitability, end quote, of this movement, bracket, the breakdown of agricultural production, end bracket, is expressly limited to the countries of Western Europe. To the countries of Western Europe, end quote, Marx, end footnote. One second. End footnote. Let's get back to where we were. While in the West, Marx writes, capitalism involved the transformation of one form of private property into another. In Russia, if capitalism were to emerge, capitalism would involve the transformation of common property into private property. In stating this, Marx is only denying that capitalism must everywhere be created in the same way. Marx is not saying explicitly that capitalism as such can be avoided. The letter ends with the paragraph on the village commune, quote, thus the analysis given in Capital assigns no reason for or against the vitality of the rural community. But the special research into this subject which I conducted, the materials for which I obtained from the original sources has convinced me that this village community is the mainspring of Russia's social regeneration. But in order that the village community might function as the mainspring of Russia's social regeneration, one would first have to eliminate the deleterious influences which assail the village community from every quarter, and then to ensure the conditions normal for spontaneous development. End quote. Marx. This is a very cautious statement. Marx is, quote, flirting with the commune, but stopping short of an outright commitment. Marx would not like to believe, it seems, that there is a basis in Russia for a non-capitalist development. On the other hand, Marx is far from certain that this basis is strong enough or that it has not already been undermined by Western economic influences. Less than a year later, in the Russian preface to the Communist Manifesto, Marx formulated the issue in the form of a question. Quote, can the Russian Obshchina, or the village community, though greatly undermined, yet a form of primeval common ownership of land, pass directly to the higher form of communist common ownership? Or, on the contrary, must the Obshchina first pass through the same process of dissolution as constitutes the historical evolution of the West? End quote. Once again, Marx offered no definite answer, but this time Marx introduced a new variable. Quote, if the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West, so that both complement each other, the present Russian common ownership of land may serve as the starting point for a communist development. End quote. Marx. Footnote. In the original manuscript, find the word, quote, West. A clause is stricken out. It reads, quote, the decomposition of the communal ownership of land in Russia can be evaded, end quote. End footnote. This somewhat clarifies the source of Marx's fascination, however muted, with the commune, perhaps even the source of Marx's interest in Russia generally. Already in 1877, Marx had become optimistic about the possibilities of an upheaval in Russian society. Footnote. See in his letter of the 27th of April 1877 to F.A. Zorga in selected correspondence, in which Marx wrote, quote, this time the revolution begins in the East, hitherto the unbroken bulwark and reserve army of counter-revolution, end quote. Marx. This was written following the initial Russian setbacks in the war with Turkey of that year. Shortly afterwards, however, the war ended with a Russian victory. A similar idea of revolution beginning in the East seems to have struck Marx as early as 1853. See his article, Revolution in China and in Europe, in Avenari's edited volume, especially the remark on page 64 about the effect on England of a revolution in China. End footnote. Marx then noted that, quote, all sections of Russian society are in full decomposition economically, morally, and intellectually, end quote. Marx. It must have occurred to Marx, therefore, that a backward society, subject to the sudden and thus more disorienting impact of capitalist penetration, might collapse before the more developed societies. In such a case, if there was no concomitant revolutionary explosion in the West, the backward country would in all likelihood undergo a full-fledged bourgeois revolution. This at least was the most that could be hoped for against the background of a capitalist Europe. If, however, there occurred, more or less simultaneously, a proletarian, that is, socialist revolution in Europe, this could lead to a general conflagration in which the backward nation will be swept along by the socialist flames. Thus, Russia might avoid capitalism, and thus the Obshchina might yet become the basis for Russia's socialism. Footnote. Velitzky claims that in Marx's view the avoidance of capitalism in Russia, quote, was not ... dependent on the previous victory of the socialist revolution in the West, end quote. Velitzky argues this claim partly by citing the previously quoted final paragraph from Marx's letter to Vera Zasulich. But, as we have seen, there was nothing in this paragraph to imply the task of, quote, eliminating the deleterious influences, end quote, on the village commune, a task essential if the commune was to be preserved, was simply a matter of the revolutionary struggle in Russia. On the contrary, there was the clear implication that this task was dependent on successfully withstanding the invasion of European capitalism. And how could European capitalism be withstood in Russia unless it was being undermined at home? Marx clearly hoped for a war on two fronts. He continued to be optimistic about an eventual revolution in Europe, and Marx came to think Russia might provide the spark for it. He made the success of socialism in the latter dependent upon its success in the former. He flirted with the Obst-China idea and with Russian populism, but he did not subscribe to the populist view of the Russian future as independent of Europe. End footnote. Conversely, however, there was in all this the clear inference that if in the meantime the commune failed to maintain itself against, quote, deleterious capitalist encroachments, against the, quote, process of dissolution, that basis for a shortcut to socialism would have disappeared, and Russia, like the West, would have to pass through a capitalist stage of development. But whatever the case, the prospect of Russian developments becoming a, quote, signal for the European Socialist Revolution explains, it seems, Marx's fascination with Russian society. It is true that Marx's position in Russia was not so clear-cut as to make only one interpretation of it possible, and as was to happen so often with Marx's work after his death, followers and opponents alike, Marxist populists and others in Russia, found in Marx's words whatever each wished or looked for. In spite of himself, Marx could be all things to all men and certainly a man for all seasons. But if Marx sometimes raised questions without categorically answering those questions, Marx's lifelong colleague, Engels, had the compensatory ability of quickly putting perplexed minds at rest. Thus, if Marx's pronouncements on Russian social questions were sometimes the source of many contradictory interpretations, those of Engels could have left no one in doubt as to what the, quote, Marxist position should be. This does not mean, however, that this was a position the essence of which, as opposed to the formulation, Marx would have rejected. Although Engels, like Marx, had intermittently commented on Russian affairs from the 1850s onward, Engels' most complete treatment of the subject is to be found in two main articles, the one written in 1875, the other after Marx's death in 1894. Footnote, on social relations in Russia and of 1875 and Russia and the Social Revolution Reconsidered in 1894. The English versions of both these articles, the first under the title Russia and the Social Revolution, and with the date incidentally given wrongly as 1873, appear in Blackstock and Hoselitz. The 1875 article is written in the form of a polemic against the Russian populist socialist Peter Tkachev. End footnote. Both are so identical in the views which they convey that they can be dealt with as one, in spite of the nearly 20-year time lapse between them. The gist of the articles is that on the whole, not much in the way of autonomous development can be expected from the phenomenon of communal agriculture in Russia. Engels argued that similar peasant communities have existed even until recent times in Germany, in Ireland, in Poland, not to mention India, and everywhere they were characteristic of those societies which were in a low state of productive development. Nowhere were they able to provide a basis for more sophisticated production, so that in the course of time, progress came to depend, in fact, on their abolishment. It was the same in Russia, where more advanced forms of production not only did not arise from the village communities, but had to struggle against the village communities to succeed. Moreover, the Russian autocracy was in great part a product of the communal system. Quote, the complete isolation of the various villages from each other, which produces in the whole country identical, but the very opposite of truly common interests, is the natural basis of Oriental despotism, and from India to Russia, this type of social structure has always produced despotism wherever it was paramount, and has always found its completion in this form of government. Not only the Russian state in general, but the Russian state's specific form, the despotism of the Tsar, instead of being suspended in midair, is a necessary and logical product of Russian social conditions. End quote. Engels. Engels was not sure whether the Russian Obshchina was any longer a viable community, even in its existing form. Engels saw the Russian Obshchina as being in the process of disintegration, a process brought about by, on the one hand, its inability to cope with its productive economic needs, and on the other, by the expansion of industry, commerce, and urban life in Russia. It was a process which was, in Engels' view, nearly inevitable, and certainly could not be arrested by the commune's internal forces. Salvation, if salvation was to be sought at all, had to be sought elsewhere. Quote, we see that communal property long ago passed communal property's high point in Russia, and to all appearance is nearing communal property's doom. Yet there exists, doubtless, the possibility of transforming this social organization into a higher form, ... But this can only happen if in Western Europe a victorious proletarian revolution is achieved before the complete disintegration of communal property. This would provide the Russian peasant with the preconditions to such a transformation. ... End quote. Engels. Should this revolution occur, a society such as Russia, Engels was willing to grant, will be much better prepared for the socialist transformation, since Russia could rely on already embedded collectivist traditions. Thus, only under such circumstances could capitalism be avoided. Quote, it is not only possible but certain that, after the victory of the proletariat and transfer of the means of production to common ownership among Western European peoples, the backward and bracket countries, ... will derive from the remnants of common ownership and the corresponding folkways a powerful means of appreciably shortening their process of development to a socialist society, and of escaping most of the sufferings and struggles through which we in Western Europe have had to labor. End quote. Engels, Russia and the Social Revolution Reconsidered. Like Marx at the end of the 1870s, so Engels, writing in 1894, was prepared to contemplate the possibility of revolution breaking out first in Russia. Nevertheless, even in such an eventuality, its prospects as a socialist revolution would be determined by what followed elsewhere. Thus, Engels concluded, quote, the revolution in Russia will give a new impetus to the working class movements of the West, and provide the working class movements of the West with better conditions for the struggle. Thus, the revolution in Russia will hasten the victory of the modern industrial proletariat, without which contemporary Russia cannot achieve a socialist transformation arising either out of the village community or out of capitalism. End quote. Engels. On the basis of these, I fucked up. 1 second. Yes, Engels. On the basis of these 2 articles by Engels, both of which were openly published and widely read, we may justifiably conclude that whatever the controversy over Marx's own writings on these matters, there could be little doubt in anyone's mind as to the quote Marxist position as formulated by no less an authority than Engels. In this sense, therefore, it is possible to speak of a definite Marx-Engels legacy on the question of Russia to Russian Marxism, but whether the legacy had any serious or lasting impact on the Russian Marxist movement is, of course, another matter. The end. Thank you for listening.